Welcome to AROYA Office Hours Live. My name is Keisha, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. A couple of reminders before we get started. This hour is your chance to hear from the experts, get answers in real time about data you're seeing with your grow, and share cultivation tips and tricks with other growers in this exciting industry. We thank everybody in advance for not using this time for things like airing policy or industry grievances or asking about AROYA pricing, although you are always welcome to book a demo to get more on that. Feel free to type your questions in the chat at any time. If your question is selected, we'll ask you to unmute yourself and you can feel free to ask away. Plus, as a special treat, we're sending an AROYA hat to anyone who asks a question during today's live session. So that's pretty exciting. Jason, Seth, you ready for our first question from Instagram?
Sure. Let's get us started.
Hey, excellent. All right. So Stealth LED wants to know, for a 10-week strain, when would be the average time to switch to generative at the end of flower?
So for a 10-week strain, kind of our general rule for switching on steering techniques is keeping an eye on your plant height. So if you have run that strain before, make sure that you are making manual readings, doing some crop registration as far as your plant height goes. Get an idea of its stretching timeline. You get an idea of when you ideally are hitting your flower. Hopefully that's on your projected production schedule. And so, I mean, it's still going to be strain dependent as far as the exact right time goes. If you are transplanted and you've got rooted into your final media volume, then usually we'll talk about hitting generative steering pretty much the same time that you're flipping to flower. And depending on that strain, running 2 to 4 or 5 weeks of generative steering. Usually for 10-week strains, they're going to be a little bit more of the sativa timelines, not finishing up quite as fast, but that's kind of our general recommendations. Seth, what do you go with?
I think you nailed it. I mean, just doing your crop registration, making sure you've got that data to show like, all right, we're stretching really rapidly. Now it's slowing down and it's stopped. So if you're taking it once a week, it's going to be harder to nail that exact day count than if you're taking it every other day or every day, plant height that is. Yeah,
exactly. And we always like to recommend taking your plant heights on the same plants that you have sensors on. That way you're kind of pairing up the same data. So you can see the root zone performance and making sure that that is correlated to the same plant that you're taking some of those crop registration numbers on.
Yep, I think you nailed it. I mean, it's a 1 or 10,000 kind of number is the way I look at it. So if we're only doing it off of 25 plants on a bench or something like that, we're not getting statistically significant data if we're randomly sampling there. So it's almost to the point, that's why we take node spacing too. You can look at plant height and then look at your node spacing. When your node spacing is still stretching, you see those new nodes becoming shorter and shorter, you can really time the end of your stretch and start to go into bulking.
Great, excellent. Okay, so we have our next question. He comes from Kush Enthusiast. They want to know, when hand watering, what should I be aiming for in order to steer vegetatively? And they also ask the same question for generatively.
Ooh, hand watering. I'm going to stay out of this one. Let you do it.
My biggest question would be, do you have a day job? Because that's, if you're hand watering and you have any kind of sizable grow, even above 500 or 1,000 square feet, that's what you're going to be doing all day to steer vegetatively. And it probably can't be that big because you're going to be needing to hit those plants every hour or less, depending on, how quickly they're drying back and how small of a shot you're trying to apply. So the answer for vegetatively would be, you need to be there all day. If you're hand watering and trying to go generative, that's a lot easier to accomplish. We can kind of dial our pot size so that we have that short irrigation window, can hold water till the next day. But you're not going to be successful going vegetatively with hand watering unless you can be there and watching your graph and go, all right, it dried back 1%, I'm going to go hit it again. But even then, you're going to run into problems with washing all the EC out of your pot, most likely, because it's going to be very difficult for you to apply water in the range of 100 to 150 milliliters to each plant.
Yeah, so just to use some general metrics there. Say if we're irrigating 1,000 plants by hand, it might take 3 or 4 hours in the morning. Those plants, to be properly steering vegetatively, are already going to need to be irrigated before you're done irrigating. And then if we've got a strain that we really need to push on vegetative, it might be a 8 or 10 hour irrigation window, so first to last irrigation. So that's really significant portion of your day, or maybe even more than the entire working period, just trying to irrigate. So obviously on a smaller scale, some of that hand watering can happen, but anybody that does ROI on irrigation systems, on fertigation automation, is going to find that lower flow drip rates are going to help the consistency across your room. They're going to be one of the essential parameters to start crop steering effectively.
Yep, you nailed it, dude. And I think we can both attest we've drug hoses around the same place watering 1,000 plants, and it does take all morning. That 3 hours is no joke. And then go back and do it again in the afternoon to try to keep up. It's a challenge. That's the best way to put it. It's a big challenge.
Sounds like a full-time job. Just the watering.
Very much.
Yeah. Okay. And just a reminder to the folks who are on with us today, please feel free to type any questions you have in the chat for your chance to ask the experts live. I have another question from Instagram, and I know I'm probably going to mangle this person's handle, but Ketcha Gian wants to know, as far as drybacks go, what's the ideal range you want to be at during the flowering cycle?
It's a very general question. Usually we're trying to break that down into different phases. So that's the basis of how we like to crop steer, is talking about a harvest group of a whole bunch of different phases, usually at least 4 to get started with. So maybe if you're not in your final media yet, you can do some initial rooting in, which obviously those drybacks are going to be dependent on your substrate size, how well rooted you are at that point. It's kind of a very specific type of action that we're trying to get those roots to seek out water content and engulf the entire volume of the media. For generative steering, drybacks in, say the 15 to 30%, maybe a little bit more if you're pushing really, really hard in something like rock wool. Cocoa, it can be a little bit less, and that's always, with our consideration of assumed appropriate substrate size. So, if we're in, say, a substrate that's too large, it's going to be very difficult to achieve those drybacks. Your dryback is just a combination of simply 2 values, right? And that's going to be evaporation and transpiration. In this case, we're just going to talk about transpiration. If our plant is drinking, say, 3/4 of a gallon of water a day, and we're in a 3-gallon media, you're definitely going to see quite a bit less dryback. So the numbers that we're mentioning are usually with an assumed perfect size substrate. So if you are growing quite a bit bigger plants, sure, that might be a slightly larger substrate. If you're doing like a scrog or a multi-tier shorter plants, you'll see a little bit smaller substrate if you're trying to steer really appropriately. And then maybe for vegetative, we could talk about 10 to 20% drybacks in something like rock wool slabs with appropriate size plants.
Yeah, I mean, I think going into flowering, I like to hit a 5 to 10% dryback before I really attempt much steering, because if we just keep the medium too wet, we're not going to get anywhere with that. And then I look at dryback as an overall measure of like how healthy those plants are and how well they're transpiring. If we put a solid value on that number and gave you a recipe and said, all right, you need a 20% dryback at this point anytime you run any plant, that's going to vary according to like what you're actually able to achieve in environmental control. And also, as Jason said, it has everything to do with pot size. So if we've got a tiny plant in a big pot, we don't expect as much dryback. Now, is that going to be an indicator of how healthy the plant is? A little bit, but over the years, we've definitely known you can grow a 5-foot plant in a 3.5-gallon cocoa pot and run it super generatively the whole time, and you just won't get as big of a plant. You won't have the yield. So,
and a few more other considerations in there, as well as regarding environment. Anytime before you begin getting serious about crop steering, it's best practice to make environment checks. Can you provide the stability of climate for those plants to do projectable, appropriate drybacks that you're looking for? And so when we talk about things that are usually influencing stomatal conductance and overall transpiration rate in the plant, let's talk about VPD. So we've got a target temperature range. Are you hitting your target temperature range? And then checking your VPD to make sure that you're keeping the humidity appropriate for that temperature in the room. That's going to optimize the stomatal opening and try and increase the growth rate of that plant. Another thing to kind of keep in mind as well is CO2. CO2 is actually going to increase the water use efficiency of our plant. So if we're not injecting CO2, we're going to see higher drybacks, a little bit higher transpiration rate. But if we inject the appropriate amount of CO2, then we'll be providing the right amount of all inputs for that plant to be as efficient as possible, which actually means that the transpiration rate is going to be a little bit less simply because it doesn't have to pull through nearly as much water and nutrients to equalize, or it doesn't have to pull through nearly as much CO2. So we're not absorbing quite as much transpiration. There's not as much gas exchange in the plant, and it can grow the same amount. So that the target there is really the highest photosynthetic rate possible for any given environment. So also kind of comes into trying to only play with one variable at a time to make comparisons. So got a little advanced there, but I think we hit the basics.
Yeah, for sure.
That's awesome. Great. Our next question comes from Michael, who's on with us today. Michael, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask away. And if you're having tech issues, I'd be happy to ask. I'll go ahead and ask for him here. Michael wants to know, what incoming EC is your personal favorite to deal with, and what pH do you prefer?
Well, it's good to have you on here, Mike. It's nice to see you active in this incoming EC and pH. So if you mean what type of feed line EC and pH, something for Rockwool, being in that 5.5 to 5.7 is a great range to keep nutrient solubility as equalized as possible. So, for anyone that's watching that hasn't looked up pH charts for different types of substrates, I feel free to Google it. I encourage you guys to check out how your nitrogens, how your phosphoruses, how all of that is going to be absorbed at a little bit different rates depending on the pH. And so for something like Rockwool, shooting for that, say 5.5 to 5.7 is a really good range for your pH. If you're doing a cocoa, it's going to be a little bit more dependent on manufacturer, just because the makeup of that product can be slightly variant from manufacturer to manufacturer, but being in that usually 5.8 to say 6.0 range would be what I like for cocoa.
Yeah. I think you nailed it there, dude. I was going to say feeding 3.0 at a 5.6 for Rockwool is perfect. And I'll still go 3.0, but more like a 5.8 for cocoa, just because I have a little bit of cation exchange capacity there, and that cocoa can actually hold on to some ions. Thanks, Jason. Did anyone miss anything there? Was I too quiet? I can't hear myself with these headphones on.
Well, we'll throw some justifications in there. Seth was saying, 3.0 and Rockwool for EC levels. I do like to also consider one nutrient manufacturer and composition. So some of those plants are going to eat a little bit differently depending on the specific blend that you're using. Another factor in there is obviously strain. I mean, I know we're saying it all the time, but this is why we love databasing growth cycles, is because those strains definitely prefer different parameters as far as environment, as far as feed levels, steering strategies probably on the top of that list. And so, the better you can document how your plants respond by variation, by variety to your feed levels is a good way to optimize them. Another thing in there is thinking about your light source. So usually with something like LED, we'll run a little bit higher EC. Simply that's because when we look at leaf surface temperature, when we're looking at how that plant is feeding, when we're running LEDs, usually we're going to have a little bit less water uptake, and so our nutrient concentration needs to be slightly higher in order to provide the same amount of nutrition to that plant.
Yeah, you nailed it. We don't have the leaf surface temp to bring it up and drive that metabolism there and transpiration, so a little less pull on the plant from water below, and we want to keep that concentration in there with the EC.
Michael clarified here. He added one more comment: pith versus chunk versus strand. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say on that.
Yummy. We love cocoa.
Choose your chop. What do you like, wetter or drier?
It's a great question, Michael. Yeah, sorry, Seth. Did I interrupt you?
Oh, I was just going to say, I like to, get, basically a lot of companies out there now are kind of having a good mix. If you go with the more chunk, you're going to end up with a little drier cocoa. And then personally, I like running a cocoa that'll get me up to 55 to 65%, volumetric water content. That way I have a good range to steer in. If I'm running like a cocoa perlite mix and I can only achieve 38 or 43%, max water content, I've limited myself to my ability to steer and how long I can actually stretch out that generative steering because I only have so much water reservoir in there now.
Wonderful. Michael, thank you so much for asking your question. Be sure to stick around after the broadcast so I can get your contact info and get you an AROYA hat. Our next question comes from Turtle Farms, who's on with us today. You want to go ahead and unmute yourself? And if you're having any trouble, let me know. I know connection issues and tech. I'll just read what he wrote here. In week 6 on strains, I run. Oh, there he is. Go for it.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, dude.
Hey, I'm running 6-inch Hugos for the first time. I've never run the Rockwell. I've always been a cocoa guy. And I have a sensor in each table. One table, even with 3, I'm feeding P2 feeds into the dark cycle in P3. So after the lights go out, they're still getting hit 1 more time on the hour, 3 more times, boom, boom, boom. Mm-hmm. And I'm still seeing, one started drying back so bad I got channeling. It only maxes out at about 55% water content. Mm-hmm. The other one, the Slurricane, it hits 71, 72% at runoff and at max content. And it's still hitting, even with those 3 night feeds, 41% by lights on plus 2 hours,
Sure. So, usually when we're seeing this, you're growing a pretty big plant, and it's growing aggressively. So you're running out of substrate volume. That plant is pulling more water than you can appropriately steer. And so that's why you are running into your dark periods. We always try to irrigate no later than about an hour or 2 hours before lights off. And obviously in your case, you're doing what you have to maintain some amount of plant health. But this is where, you might consider going into a slab next time. So like a 4x4.
Yeah, for sure. Next run. But so as far as keeping this one, the plants still look great, but would I just keep riding out, adding P3s, adding night feeds into the P3 cycle?
I think that's going to be your option. Yeah. And this is kind of one of the challenges, of steering without a substrate that's appropriately sized or the perfect size is simply because now, rather than irrigating based on how you're trying to control the morphology of that plant, you're irrigating to just keep water levels
keep up with
sufficient.
It.
Exactly.
Yeah. So then why that sensor is only getting up to 55% is that's because it just dried down too hard too many times and it won't reach max water content. Because I can wait till I'm at full saturation for the day, which for that sensor is 55, 56%. Mm-hmm. And then I can hand water on top of the cubes and I can get them up to about 60, 61. But then, within a day, they're really maxing out at 55 again.
Yeah, it is likely. Usually when we see field capacities in rock wool under that, say 65 or 75%, that's the usual range that we see field capacity for a well-maintained rock wool. It could be probably the 2 most common would be sensor placement. So make sure that you are using that sensor alignment tool at the right height in that block. And then the other could be, some establishment of channeling or irrigation flow through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Also, if you ever had a dry down event that went below 40% for a decent amount of time, you could have a hydrophobic pocket in there. And if you hit one of your tines into that pocket, that's going to throw off your average across the 3.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
There's a few factors that could be a problem there. Did you grow in like 1 gallon cocoa soft pots, like biochars or anything like that?
Yeah, they were 1 gallon. I was running 1 gallon cocoa before that. Yeah.
One thing that's kind of odd about switching to the Hugos is you don't get that same air pruning effect. So with rock wool, we're focusing on that suspended water table in the bottom 2 to 3 inches of the media. So when we go to that slab, we actually effectively expand that area where the plant can take up water. With those cocoa bags, we had air pruning going on where the roots were going out, splitting. We had greater absorption through the whole block. Now we're just focused on that bottom 3 inches. So if you go to like a 6-inch Hugo, you're really only using that bottom couple inches where, cohesion overcomes gravity. The water stops falling out of the block, and that's where it's most concentrated. Fortunately, what makes rock wool great is that's where your plants also uptake all their water at their root tips. So a Hugo is hard to flower a big plant out of towards the end, basically.
Yeah, I learned that.
Seen it.
I learned that the hard way, and for sure,
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to stick slabs under them. So what's the max dryback I can see before I'm running into channeling? Like, what's the ride in the line there?
We just try to stay, above, absolutely no lower than 35%, but trying to stay above 40% for something like a Hugo.
Yep. Give yourself that 5% buffer. Even if you're in cocoa, if you could get up to 55, I'd say call 25 your bottom end, because invariably you're going to wake up some mornings and check that graph when you get to work, and it's going to be
so
it will dip down lower than you wanted.
So it is a sliding scale like that. If I'm maxing out at 55, I would drop to 20. You'd still call that a 25% dryback?
Not on the rock wool or the cocoa really is it sliding, but yeah, to an extent. Like we have our absolute bottoms on every media that we don't want to go below. Otherwise, we're going to see yield reduction. Water is always one of your key yield limiting components. If you're 10% low on your water content for 10 days in your grow, that's a significant amount of water and time that you deprive that plant of.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Seth was getting to there is that rock wool is probably a little bit more susceptible to some of that channeling. Not that cocoa isn't, but when we look at the matrix potential curves of rock wool versus cocoa, the matrix potential curve in rock wool is very linear, so it still doesn't apply almost any irrigation stressors to the plant, even when you are getting lower in water content. So that plant can pull that block to almost to zero without necessarily feeling an irrigation deficit, if we use terminology from traditional horticulture. Whereas cocoa, it's actually going to start applying a little bit more pressure as we drop down into, say, that 25% area. And so that's kind of where we're drawing those lines at, is where is a safe spot that that media can recover its intended properties, or its naturally best operating parameters, if you will.
So then, if that Hugo, the 6-inch Hugo, is running in ideal conditions, what is the max you want that thing drinking a day before you'd say, hey, I really have to go into slabs, I don't have a choice next time?
P3s. If you're there, you can't maintain a generative dryback. That means you either need a smaller plant or a bigger reservoir of water to draw from.
Yeah, for sure. So
that's a good line. And honestly, we see it all the time. People hitting trouble, finishing on Hugos just because of that. You get a big, beautiful plant that's grown real aggressively, done real well, and then at the end, it's just really hard to apply that generative stress and really up your potency and ripen it.
Yeah.
And to be honest, like when I switched from 3.5 gallon pots back in the day to 1 gallon cocoa pots, same thing happened the first round. Grew them way too big. Had to put water on them all day just to keep them from dying. And then the next round we figured it out. Like, just flower them smaller, match their plant to the pot size, and we won't run into that issue quite as hard.
So to re-go generative at the end, it'd be next to impossible. I'd be drying them back to it'd be all kinds of crazy. Like, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
The best you can do is try to, give as much space in between irrigations as possible, like your P1 and your P2s. Stretch that out, because really what we're doing, we're not applying drought stress in the traditional sense. We're making it hard for the plant to uptake water. We're just spacing out those irrigation signals. We're not telling it to grow all day. It's not raining all day. It's not springtime for the plant anymore.
Yeah.
Awesome. Turb Turtle, thank you so much for bringing this up. We had a great conversation. And
awesome. No, thank you guys so much.
Yeah, no, be sure to stick around. Of course, let us know if you have any other questions. I just wanted to share Michael's comments in the chat here. He also is a proponent of slabs. He wrote, they really help with rock wool. I found it very difficult to run without them. We're finding the Botanicare 6x6 cocoa cubes are working really well to steer under HPS and LED, a mix of strand and chunk. Yeah, so great to hear what's working for cultivators in this space. I have another question from Instagram while as we continue on here. This one comes from Kush Pops. In the middle of flowering, if drybacks are too large for P3, can you give shots in the middle of the night?
I think we hit that one with Turp Troller here just a minute ago. usually always try to avoid night irrigations if we can. If we have to do night irrigations, it's usually a good signal that our substrate volume is too small for the size of plant that we're growing at that point. So I think we've got that one checked off.
Another thing too, if you find yourself having to apply P3s, being able to log your overnight humidity and VPD is also super helpful. Like it's pretty rare. Most people experience the humidity going up at night because your lights go off, temperatures go down, the equation changes, your RH goes up. If, however, you're one of the few people that experience it the other way and your humidity just drops out at night, your dryback's going to happen a lot faster overnight than you want just due to evaporation and pulling that water up into the air. So it's a delicate balance. If you're trying down too hard, that's something you want to check too, is make sure your VPD is in range and stable overnight. Big swings really affect that dryback curve.
Great. Okay. River City Growers submitted this next question. They're asking, what are some key points you guys hit when coming to the last week of flower?
Key points? Are they just looking for like tips on ripening strategies?
I'm thinking, yeah, maybe some metrics or some data points that they're should be looking out for.
So, I mean, some of the obvious ones is, try to have an understanding of the appropriate timeline for that strain. So that's being, documenting your trichome colors towards the end per cultivar so that you can make sure that you're allocating the appropriate amount of production time for that type of strain. And then obviously, if you do have that expectation set up, then, keep an eye on terpene profiles, keep an eye on your leaf colorations, all that types of stuff. So, ripening strategies, I like to apply at the appropriate time for each strain. Things like some increased nighttime, daytime differentials help produce anthocyanins, get as much color out of that plant as it can express. And then also, for ripening, we can drop our feed EC, sometimes, a quarter drop to a half drop, and save a little bit of nutrients as long as we're pushing a really good generative signal to that plant to make sure it ripens up as much as we can get for that product.
Yeah, I think you nail it. The only thing I'd add is go buy yourself a loop that's got a little tiny ruler inside of it. They exist. You can start looking at your trichome sizes, which is pretty cool because run to run, you can start trying to optimize how sparkly that bud looks and see some of those results. The other thing, like as Jason was saying, you can drop your EC. And one of the biggest things to watch out for when you do that, and I do know a lot of people like to just straight flush anymore, is now that you're using AROYA, you can see that root zone EC. So if you're flushing really hard and you're just pushing EC out of the bottom, it's not starving the plant because we look at that more like vitamins than actual food for it. But we want those buds to be as healthy as possible when harvest comes around. I've seen it a lot of times where people will pull down a beautiful crop and 3 days later they've got botrytis in the hanging room, in the dry room. Part of that could be dry room conditions. Some of it is that we live in a world with mold spores flying around everywhere. Unless you have a HEPA filter in that room 24/7, you're going to have those. So if you go in with a plant that has weakened cells inside the bud, that's a point where mold can germinate and hit.
Yeah, it's kind of why I really try to avoid the term flushing where we're at in the industry nowadays, just because I think historically connotation, a lot of people have different ideas on what flushing means, and that's kind of specifically it's an activity, whereas ripening is kind of the terminology I like to apply for that last, say, 5 to 7 days, maybe a little longer on a long running strain. But that's a goal, right? We're trying to ripen as a goal. How you get there can be a little bit different depending on what type of plant you're running, what environment you've got, what substrate you've got, and what terpene profile you're shooting for, that color of those trichomes, etc. So that's one reason I definitely like to call it ripening instead, is because from our experience running straight RO can do exactly what Seth was saying. And so sure, you can decrease your nutrients, but going for a flush as the goal is something I personally like to try and avoid.
Great. And let me read Michael's comments here. USB microscopes are fantastic for checking your finish. So he wanted to also add that to the conversation.
They're great. Plus you get actual pictures with those. Pretty rad.
Yeah. And so great way to attribute that from cycle to cycle and by strain is throw that in as a note in the AROYA system, or task somebody on your team to take some trichome pictures in there, take some finishing pictures, get an idea of what those leaf colors look like, and dial in how many days specifically you need for that plant and how many days you want to be doing ripening activities.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. All right. We've got another question here from Instagram. This one comes from Shark Mouse Farms. They want to know, is there any literature or data to suggest that initiating your generative cues will shorten time from transition to 12-hour light schedule to reproductive development, assuming everything is dialed in correctly? I flipped 3 separate genotypes from 3 separate breeders, and all are showing defined pistil development 4 days in. Thoughts on that?
So using generative steering to promote flowering. We're definitely putting a little bit of drought stress on the plant. Like, let's say you sprouted a seed and went 12-12, you're already putting it right away into those flowering conditions and kind of avoiding veg. But cannabis is still a photoperiod plant, so that generative stress might speed it up a little bit. But over applying it's going to affect your yield at a certain point.
This is where the target plant height going in per strain is really the best metric to calculate when you should be starting flower and some of that generative stuff, because we want to veg out as fast as possible. For the plant growth to be as effective overall as we need, we want to make sure we're getting the vegetative plant organs, the structures that are stems, stalks, and leaves. We want to get those built up as absolute fast as possible during the veg 18-6, or some people run 24 on, but 18-6 is pretty unanimous. So we want to get those vegetative, the infrastructure of the plant growing as fast as possible. So that's why we do usually recommend veg steering during 18-6, is establishing the basis to encourage plant growth or flower growth. So get that plant set up, get it the infrastructure that it needs to build as many buds as possible. Then we'll induce the bud sites, get those node sites stacked up as quick as possible during our generative. And then after that plant's been signaled to be as reproductive as it can, then we'll let it live out the rest of its life with some bulking. So get those reproductive sites, those buds, those flowers established, and then bulk them out as much as possible through the remainder of the cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big thing we look at here in crop steering is optimizing plant health at every part of the cycle. When we stress the plant too much, we're basically delaying growth. We're going to impact how quickly it's metabolizing. Along with what Jason said, if you are, let's say, topping in veg, one thing you'll notice, the plant stalls out. All right. That gives us more time in veg. That adds more to our total cycle, longer turnaround time. So what's our potential solution? Not topping, flipping the plant a little earlier and potentially upping our density. All right, that allows that plant to not take up as much square footage during its life cycle in our facility. So all those plants got to pay their rent, right? Nothing's free inside your farm. So anytime we have to fight the plant, we're losing money and time. So the idea is we really want to optimize everything we can for the plant and steer it, not necessarily fight it. And that's the same, if we're going to talk about like de-leafs or anything we do, every action you put on that plant costs time and money. So we want to maximize growth at every point, minimize work we put in, and not fight the plant.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Seth, because when we do talk about crop steering, we're modulating parameters around a balance, right? And so if we had a balance, then that plant is going to express its morphology based on having a equalized pressure from either side of where we're trying to grow, right? And so really, when we say generative or vegetative, there are degrees. There's an intensity to it. It's a vector. So we're looking at a steering direction and a steering intensity. And obviously, if we take things too far, whether with the environment or with irrigation, either way, we're going to be fighting that plant again, which is going to be counterproductive. So it is talking about using the right steering direction for the appropriate amount of time at the right intensity.
Great. Just a reminder to the folks who are on with us today, feel free to type your question in the chat for a chance to get it answered live. But I do have a two-part question here that Gas House Gardens submitted. Let me start with part one, and I summarized a little bit of it here. When stacking EC in the block, can we still achieve runoff to maintain proper nutrient solution? They go on to describe a no runoff scenario where the plant is actively taking up certain nutrients more quickly while other nutrients are taken on passively. The passively uptaken nutrients are building up in the block more than the active ones. So this person is wondering if while building EC, should they compensate for those active nutrients to maintain proper ratios during stretch and ripening?
If you can. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And fortunately, nutrient blends out there have significantly improved over the number of years, and cannabis producers do have better accessibility to well-balanced nutrients. That being said, obviously, it sounds like you guys are probably doing leaf tissue sample analysis to try and get an idea of what that imbalance looks like. It is a good approach to try and keep that balance right. So keep an eye on the runoff pH. And that runoff pH is an easy way on site to kind of keep track of the runoff balance of nutrients, right? So if the plant's taking up a little bit more of the negatively charged nutrient ions, then you're going to see a pH rise, and vice versa on that. So that's a good way to kind of monitor how that's going on. That being said, if you can identify specifically what nutrients you need to add to compensate, that would be one way to do it. And because if you are doing no runoff and you do have some buildup, like you're saying, then there's some missing pieces in that building blocks of that plant trying to grow as best as possible.
Yeah. I mean, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to use runoff as our crutch to maintain all this. But in reality, in practicality, when we hit the actual grow space, runoff is our friend for modulating how well our EC stacks. So unless you're coming into flower at a really low EC and you're struggling to stack it, you should be pushing a small amount of runoff at the end of your P1s. And that's just going to keep that, stacking from getting dramatically higher day after day. We just want to keep it in a range for each phase of steering. We don't want to stack it crazy high. We don't want to flush it out. As with anything, when we make big changes, the plant struggles to respond to that. So it's just knocking time off of, our time we actually are spending in perfect growing conditions or prime growing conditions and having the plant metabolize.
Yeah, and so while we're on that too, I think one of the questions I get a lot of times is people scared of if their EC getting pretty high by nighttime or before the next irrigation in the next morning. And so when we do talk about kind of EC stacking, usually we're talking about the nominal or the daily return of that EC after irrigation. And that's the number you want to be looking at when you're modulating the runoff. The EC rise after your irrigation is going to be a little bit more indicator inversely related to your drybacks and stuff. So don't necessarily get too worried if you do see your ECs rising up very quickly on a day basis. But if it is climbing too rapidly for day over day, then you probably want to have just slightly more runoff.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. And then if you start looking at ranges of plant toxicity versus availability in different nutrients, the tolerance is actually quite wide for where you can be fairly high EC and have access to these, and it actually doesn't hurt the plant. It's more of an osmotic pressure situation rather than a toxicity, particularly unless we're talking about nitrogen late in flower. Usually, the plant will put up with a lot more than we give it credit for. It's just after all these years of paying attention to runoff and not seeing what was going on in the root zone, we never saw those, 22 DC swings, at 7 in the morning, a few hours before you start watering. We just didn't see that in ripening before. All we saw was that runoff that came out, which is already, diluted by the nutrient solution you're putting on it. Like we just didn't have the visibility. I didn't for years. And it blew my mind when I put some sensors in and went, wow, we're not feeding that much.
It's cool stuff.
Yeah.
It definitely helps having a little bit of visibility on things that you can't really tell.
Yeah. And, don't forget to look at your plants either. Like you might look at that and see, wow, this thing's hitting 18, but then you go look at it and finishing, it's just beautiful. Healthy plant, you know. They will really surprise you at what you can throw at them sometimes.
Michael posted a couple of questions while we were talking about this. How often would you recommend runoff testing? And do you recommend leach testing at all?
What are we talking for a difference between runoff and leach? Because usually leachate is going to be runoff from what I'm used to doing. As far as I like to record it every day.
Yep.
But I am more data is better. If I didn't need the data, it's cheaper to throw it out than it is to try and recreate it in the next cycle. So I like to have a catch cup under one or a few plants in there, at least per strain. See if you can get runoff volume and see if you can get pH and runoff EC. To get used to using the EC in your substrate, you may retire from taking runoff EC measurements, but there's really no substitution for runoff volume and runoff pH on a daily basis if you can.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Paying attention to that runoff pH is very important. You know, especially if you're having any water quality issues or anything like that, like having that runoff test and data to look back at and go like, man, it's just one more metric to see everything that happened. And while you aren't going to be steering your whole crop based off runoff, it's still very valuable data.
Michael clarified here, leach testing meaning more flushing the medium out with standard food to measure the internal EC and pH of the substrate. And so his original question is, do you recommend leach testing at all?
I wouldn't, not with modern hydro substrates, cocoa or rock wool. The information that you need can come just from a typical daily runoff.
Yeah, in order to do an accurate leach test too, you basically better take a hole saw out there, drill a core out of one of your blocks, take it in and flush it with deionized water and see what you actually have there. That's what we'd do in a soil lab, and that's what's going to actually give you the composition of what's in there. Or stick a sensor in it, see what your EC is looking like in there. Because that's the other thing. And unless you're going to take time for R&D on some of these things, certain things will be destructive. That's the reality. Like if you want a full clean soil analysis, you got to send that to a lab.
Turtle Farms, you posted a comment. You want to unmute yourself and speak to it?
Sure. The guy was talking about EC buildup, and a few times when I've had my blocks build up too early, like through the stretch, and I've let it build up way too early, it almost always seems like it's nitrogen that I get overwhelmed on. And those particular phenols will just continue overstretching, and then they lose all their bud structure. I've seen it happen 2 or 3 times.
Absolutely. So nitrogen actually acts as a plant growth regulator in high enough concentrations, which can happen when you're building EC in the block. That's why, when you get to mid-flower, you're cutting a lot of nitrogen out of your feed schedule. So we don't want to push that super hard. And that can even lead to, if you run an early flower or a veg solution all the way through, you'll probably notice huge internodes, loose buds, foxtailing, even though it's only 77 degrees in there. But yeah, that's literally because that is acting almost like auxin or any other plant hormone and driving growth. And the other side of that is that'll push other deficiencies. If you're running, nitrogen too high, you'll smack your head right into calcium deficiencies 2 weeks in. You'll see all these other problems arising from the fact that nitrogen is just pushing the plant so hard, specifically in cell elongation and not division. So that's why you see your buds not getting bigger. The cells are stretching, but they're not dividing and turning into more flower.
It's tough to recognize, and until I had the sensors in there, it was tough to even recognize, because I had a couple of phenos that would stay looking perfectly healthy. No clawing, not too dark, no tip burn, no nothing. I couldn't tell they were over on anything until I stuck the sensors in there. And I almost threw away 2 phenos. The sensors saved them for me. Are you kidding me? Made a huge difference.
All I had to do was save some money on fertilizer.
Yeah,
but,
that was it.
But that's what's crazy is there's such a range in plant responses, to different EC levels and different levels of different nutrients. If anyone's ever grown in deep water culture, it's a great example of the fact that we can't actually push anything into the plant. We give it all. We put out the plate. It eats what it wants. That's the reality. So we just got to make sure it doesn't preferentially eat one thing too much. Can't feed it too much nitrogen. And then, yeah, same thing. You want to make sure you're not running into those limiting factors. You'll end up in the same bad boat. If you're low on nitrogen, too high on calcium, everything plays together.
For sure. I've been cutting with the Athena, they were on like 40, 60 or whatever, core to bloom. And now through week 3, I cut it back to 20/80. And then sometimes by the end, I'll even cut it harder. So, and I have much better results that way too. And oddly enough, letting the pH run a little higher in the medium has helped prevent that from happening too. It's like it doesn't want to absorb as much of the nitrogen. So it's helped it.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've looked at that plant nutrient availability versus pH. That's one great way to modulate it. Like if you're like, hey, I've got this feed solution, I don't have a lot of choices, I can up the pH and restrict that nitrogen uptake just a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. It's helped a ton.
Cool.
Awesome.
I'm glad you realized that on your own. That's awesome, dude. Just through observation.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Gas House, they had a second question. The other question they asked was, during ripening, I'm noticing uneven ripening from tops to bottoms, even with the DLI of 65. Can we utilize crop steering to help with the process of evenly ripening our crop, or would that be a nutritional issue?
There could be a number of things into play here. The first one in my mind would just be light penetration. The tops of your plants are the ones that are getting that 65 DLI. And so, if we look at leaf area index would be the traditional metric that gives you a number as far as, hey, this is how much light is being blocked through the canopy, right, into those lower segments. So, how do you avoid that? There's a couple, things in the industry, some under canopy lighting, some side lighting. I don't necessarily have much experience or any verified research on how that affects the plant growth, but light intensity would probably be the one that comes to mind as far as I know for ripening differential on the plant.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Each bud, just like say a tomato or something, we need so much input in terms of light, water, and CO2 to build that, obviously along with the rest of our nutrients. So those lower buds are not getting as much light. Like effectively we could say, all right, they're getting half the light. Theoretically, they're going to take almost twice as much time to actually ripen up. They're just not going to grow as big. They're not going to be as mature. So in my experience, the best way to deal with that is prune hard and prune early. Get rid of that under foliage that you're not going to have or that you're going to end up throwing away. If you're pulling off buds at week 3 or 4, doing your second cleanup, you're just throwing away money that you put into growing those. Whereas if you could have pruned those up, around flip, let's say, then you're not spending time flowering out and building up plant matter that you're going to throw away throughout the cycle. And obviously we have leaves that we're going to throw away at different points, but not investing the time into developing buds that we don't want is probably the best way to get around that.
Yeah, just to justify pruning hard, that does mean maintaining a balance so that the plant still has enough. They're just like solar panels, right? These plants are absorbing light energy based on the amount of surface area that is exposed to energy. So we've got photons hitting that plant surface, providing it the catalyst for the photosynthetic product or process, And so we don't want to strip past the point of reducing the trajectory of that plant growth. So it is a good balance, just to justify the hard value.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't like to scare people when I say that, but it's hard to say that without having a picture in front of me to show you. But it is something you need to dial for each strain, and that's also sometimes why taking pictures in veg, and anytime you do any defoliation and say, okay, I'm going to take pictures of this related to that run, because I know a lot of people have experienced this. I have. When you grow the same strain like 30 or 50 times, you go, it did that weird thing last spring. You guys remember, right? Like, it's doing that again. Well,
no, I don't remember. Did you document it in AROYA?
Exactly. So if you can have a picture to look back and go, okay, here's what's going on. Here's what we did. Here's how the plant's responding, because your pruning techniques are going to change for every strain. You're going to grow that a few times and get a feel for how it grows, when you're going to time your second D-leaf, everything. So it's something you got to build in and really optimize, each cultivar in your facility over time. but you're never going to get there without the data to look back at and influence your decisions for your next run.
Husky, who's on with us today, posted a comment. Husky, you want to unmute yourself and add to the conversation? What they posted was under canopy lighting. There you are. Go for it. We still have you muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just wanted to ask more on the trichome ripeness. You mentioned different strains need to be taken maybe at different times. Can you maybe talk about if clear is obviously too early, and do you go for cloudy, or do you go for really white trichomes? Do you go for any amber? Just that simple, really.
Yeah, and it's going to be a progression, right? So we're going to start with usually 100% clear trichomes is what that plant is at some point, getting closer to the harvest date. A lot of people that do, fresh frozen or some types of extracts do prefer to get a little bit earlier in that clear to cloudy duration. Typically for, flower, the market preferences are somewhere in that early amber stages.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the guys growing for bulk oil production, you're pulling it at 6 weeks because you can still get the oil yield that you want, and you're going to, formulate that into the product that you need. As far as flower goes, I think the best thing you can do is, as you're ripening, hitting that point where you're like, I might pull it today, look at it, take a sample, and if you've got the means, slowly test it over time and find out what day represents the product that you want to put out. Are you trying to put out, because even a different strain, depending on harvest day, is going to have a slightly different terpene expression as far as levels of different terpene and then potency. So you want to dial that to what you want to put out and make sure you can repeat it. So as Jason was saying on flower, a lot of times it is more on the amber side. Go in and decide what level of amber do we want? What day are we going to pull? And then, that's just another metric to make sure your consistency stays there.
And as, Michael talked about, document it with your USB microscope, put it into AROYA and say, here at day 60 for our OG Kush is, looks like this. Day 63 looks like this. And we know that, hey, we want to be at day 62 because last time we went just a little bit too long. Give yourself references. Give yourself, basically a very complete digital grow journal of as many inputs as you can. So that's really the reason that, we've worked to combine sensor data with manual entries, with notes, with tasking, is because most all of those items affect the plant growth, right? And so sure, we can be looking at sensor data, but it really takes as much metadata attributing each cycle as possible in order to replicate productivity, to eliminate unintended variables cycle to cycle, and to get an idea of how you can make incremental steps for continuous improvement.
Yeah, you summed it up right there, buddy.
Thanks, guys. That was fantastic.
Thanks for asking a question, Husky. Be sure to stick around after the broadcast. I have another question from Instagram, but also just telling our friends who are on with us today, it's not too late to get your question answered. This is the last question from Kush Enthusiast, who also asked a question earlier. Do you guys have any recommendations for collecting runoff for the purposes of analyzing the water when hand watering in cocoa?
I don't have my phone with a picture on me.
Use a tray underneath of it.
Yeah. If you go to the hardware store and get your basic plant tray full of empty starter cells, so you can space it up off the bottom and have it easy to slide that tray out and tip it out. Because if you have it sitting just in the tray, you've got to have space for the water to fall into. Otherwise, it'll just wick back up into the pot as the plant uses it. So that's the biggest thing. Any way you can devise for spacing that up, ice cube trays I've seen. People can get creative out there,
And I guess one of the things there as well is try and do a good practice of draining it every day, so if you skip a day, now your number is going to be twice as much. If you didn't document it the day before, or you forgot to document it, but it did get dumped out, then, all of those can cause problems. And so it's one of those things where your team, maybe marks it off somewhere. So if it is a task, get that task done in AROYA, do the manual readings so that you have those numbers, and that your catch bucket got dumped out, and your next day's reading is going to be exactly what happened in that 24-hour period.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, like when you start to get in more precision, go collect it after your P1s. That's once a day. Go see what your runoff is after that irrigation event. And you can really start dialing your shot size and how often you're going to do it, and start pairing that to different strains. If you let your runoff water sit there all day in an 80-degree environment with wind blowing, it might test a little hotter in both pH and EC, just because some water's evaporated. And when we're talking about 30 milliliters of water in there, 100, that's not very much. You can blow on it and that'll go away.
Great. Amazing. Seth and Jason, what a great conversation. Thank you so much. We were on a little bit of a 2-week break. It felt really good to be back with office hours today. Michael, Turtle Farms, and Husky, if you could stick around for just one more minute. I want to thank everyone who joined us for Office Hours Live this week. If you have any questions about AROYA, how it can be used to improve your cultivation production process, or any other topic you'd like covered in a future Office Hours session, please feel free to post it in the chat. Shoot us an email at support.aroya@metergroup.com, or send us a DM over Instagram. We definitely want to hear from you. We record every session. We'll email everyone in attendance today a link to the video from today's discussion, and then we will also post it on the AROYA YouTube channel. Like and subscribe while you're there. And if you find these conversations helpful, please do share them with your community and spread the word. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
See y'all next week.
Bye, guys. Till next week.
Thank you.